Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to this evening's Taller Talk. My name is Randy Guthmiller, Manager of Visitor Experiences for Ruby City. Our Taller Talks are presented in collaboration with the Carver Community Cultural Center and feature conversations with artists about their work. This evening, I'm joined by Giovanni Valderas, sorry, gosh, I've been practicing too. Giovanni Valderas, and Giovanni is a native to Dallas, Texas, where he works as the exhibition manager at the Fort Worth Community Arts Center. Previously, he was the assistant director at Kirkhopper Fine Arts and the gallery director at Mountain View College. He also served as an appointee by Dallas City Council as vice chair of the Cultural Affairs Commission. Valderas graduated from the College of Visual Arts and Design at the University of North Texas with a Master of Fine Arts in Drawing and Painting. He has taught painting and drawing courses at the University of North Texas, Richland College, and Mountain View College. He is a former member of 500X Gallery, one of the oldest co-op galleries in Texas. His work has been featured in the 2013 Texas Biennial, New American Paintings magazine, Impossible Geometries, curated by Lauren Hayes at Field Projects in New York, and 14by48.org's temporary billboard public art project. In addition, Valderas received the Moss Chumley Award from the Meadows Museum and a grant from the Nasher Sculpture Center in Dallas for his guerrilla site-specific projects. In 2018, he resigned from his reappointment to the City of Dallas Cultural Affairs Commission, having served under Councilman Omar Navarez to run for Dallas City Council to represent the neighborhood he grew up in. Valderas led a grassroots campaign where he placed in a strong second. I first encountered Giovanni's work on the streets of Dallas in something like 2016, and I am so excited to get to share his work and perspective on the world with our Ruby City audiences. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen and non-binary folks, Giovanni Valderas, welcome.
Hey, welcome. Thank you so much for the warm invite, and what's up, San Antonio, and everybody else tuning in. I love San Antonio. Thank you, Randy, for the opportunity. So yeah.
Yes, well, before we jump into everything, it has been quite a year, not only with the pandemic, but also you have run a second time for Dallas City Council, and you've continued to organize community events in Dallas. How are you doing? How are you holding up?
I'm good. It's been a challenging year for everyone. I think a lot of us we've all been impacted by COVID and also all the other hardships that come along with it. But I've been blessed to kind of push through and have a good, a circle of friends and family. And so for me, I think as an artist, at least in my sense, we live a life of privilege in the sense that we get to make art for a living. And so for me, it's like, what do I do with that privilege? And for me, I try to be a voice in the community, because most people have to work two jobs. And so if I have the opportunity to voice up on behalf of the community that can't because they're at work, then I'll do it. But yeah, but it's been like a self-reflecting kind of year for me. So yeah.
Yeah, it's really a luxury to be able to have that time to be reflexive and to think about how you can use the space that you inhabit to benefit others in your community. Absolutely. How have you been taking care of yourself during this time? Also, the pandemic brings down all of this stress. Also, running for city council, I imagine, brings on a lot of stress. Yeah, how do you practice self-care in this time?
Yeah, it's running for city council is stressful in the sense that there's a lot of time that is kind of taken away, and you have to be at places or events, and so for me, I really found that joining a gym was really good, and I joined like a small gym. Shout out to EdgeFit, who really kind of prepared me for that, because I think for me there are two kinds of campaigns. Campaigns that connect with the community, they're out every day, block walking. The other one kind of relies on like mailers and going to like events. And for us, we decided to do the first half of it. Just we block walk every day. And so, it's just being in shape, which is crazy because it's just walking. You would think like, oh no, but man, it's at the end of the day, it's a lot. So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, walking is one of those things that I love to engage in, and I always forget halfway through it that, oh, you got to walk back, and that's
Yeah.
it can get pretty exhausting. Yeah.
Exactly.
Cool.
Yeah.
Well, let's jump into it, Barbara. Barbara, let's head into that first slide. So the way that I've have organized the images here chronologically by year, some of, and I hope you can insight the work. So we're starting here with this really incredible work from 2016, this punchy blue work. Can you about this one?
Oh, sorry, Randy. Could you repeat that? You broke up a little bit. Just the ending,
Yeah.
the later part.
Can you? I just yeah. Can you tell us? Just about this work? How this work emerged in the studio?
Yeah, great question. Te jodiste is like brings so much fond memories because it reminds me of my grandmother. And as we were growing up, she would watch us quite a bit, and she would say that. And so I don't know if I'm allowed to cuss here, but um, but basically means you screwed up or you effed up, and I just thought that was just such a you know it's strange because I'm half Guatemalan, half Mexican American, and so in like Mexican culture, that's considered like a curse word, but in Guatemalan culture, is not so much. So that's where I kind of started exploring this idea of language and idioms and what they mean, and for me, that I think held such a sentimental moment for me because it reminds me of like this kind of my grandmother was very stern but kind of a comedian in a sense, and I don't know if she was trying to be that way, but it came across that way. But yeah.
Yeah, and
Oh, go ahead, I'm sorry.
go ahead. Sorry.
No, I was just gonna talk about the material.
There's also yes, please.
So obviously, I'm borrowing elements from the piñata, and I thought that was really interesting. And my work has always kind of been exploring those themes, and I thought it was really interesting, given the whole kind of history of piñatas and how they're kind of like this vehicle for subversion in a sense. When the Spaniards came in, they kind of co-opted all the traditions and kind of other things from indigenous people in Latin America.
Was that a history that you knew about before you started making the piñata inspired works?
Good question. Not necessarily. It was something that I kind of, started really reading about when I was in graduate school, kind of exploring this idea because, and I grew up in a Latinx community. So, there's piñatas everywhere, every birthday party, every event. And there was this kind of like positive kind of association with them. And I thought, oh, how interesting. And then when I started learning more about it, and kind of this darker side of the piñata is this kind of how Catholicism kind of played a role in that, and how they kind of used it to kind of assimilate indigenous people. And I was like, oh, this is interesting. This could be a tool for subversion. And I kind of took that idea and ran with it with my own work. And then I started exploring ideas of kind of public placemaking or placing artwork in the public realm.
Mhm. And the role of text plays a really large role, as we'll see in the next few slides. When did that enter into your work?
Yeah, for me, like this kind of like slang kind of idiom, was stuff that I grew up listening, in the neighborhood, and it wasn't like proper Spanish. It was like, like slang, and so I remember adopting all that, and then really, because it was inherently ours. It was part of the community, right? It wasn't like Mexican vernacular, and it wasn't American vernacular either, but it was inherently ours. And so I decided that, let's use that. And it started, obviously, I think for me, the turning point and in the new direction in the work, because before, I think the older work was a little bit more like anecdotal, and it was like easy to kind of decipher, and really based on like familial like heritage and family and things like that, and so I felt like this work kind of broadened a little bit of the conversation, and it started when I was teaching at Mountain View College, and it was my students who were like, Mountain View College is a community college in the neighborhood that I grew up in, and I was teaching art appreciation class, and everyone who was in that class, it was a spectrum of ages, ethnicities. The one thing they all agreed on is like they didn't want to be in that class. so I was like, okay, how do I get them to fall in love with art, because art can be really intimidating. And then when I just started realizing that, like when we talk about the kind of milieu of art history, it's kind of based on Western white artwork, and that really was an eye-opening experience for me, because in a sense, for me as an artist, I felt like I had to connect with my community, because that's the community that helped raise me in a sense. And so when I started exploring more about myself and where I came from, that's where kind of the work started kind of taking its own like life in a sense, and started informing me of who I was.
I love that. And we'll move to the next slide, because I think this next slide is really where we get to see the work physically going out into this community that you inhabit. And I love this image so much. I think it's really a beautiful image. It's like the text and image are both like appearing, like materializing and decaying at the same time when I'm looking at this image, and I think it's so fascinating. So with this work, this is directly like on the sidewalk or something. Can you tell us a bit about this?
Yeah, so I started this whole series that were kind of these piñata real estate signs, or commercial real estate signs, and so this was the installation that happened at Art League Houston, which was a variant of all the real estate signs that I was doing, and it was kind of based on this idea. So I live in the Oak Cliff area of Dallas, which is predominantly Latinx, and so back in 2015, 2016, just driving around, I started noticing all this new development coming in, and I thought, I was at a light one night and I was looking at this huge real estate sign. I was like, wow, it's really when it dawned on me, like, they're not building anything for the existing community. They're building something new for the new community who's about to move in. And then I started really paying attention to like this narrative that was being crafted by developers and city officials, and how, like, development was great for our community. But I felt, and I think with any, like, especially like, Latino artists like myself and Latina artists, it's just like, I felt like that was a huge disrespect on our part, in a sense that it was our community that held down the neighborhood when everybody decided to leave. It was our community who put our kids in a failing school system when no one else would. It was our community who bought homes, right? it was our community who built businesses without city subsidies. It was our community who held down this neighborhood, and now it was being treated as we were like, this neighborhood that wasn't thriving, culturally and economically, and and it's frustrating because for me, the Latinx like dollar is not equivalent to like Caucasian dollars, right? It's just we're not seen as someone who has so much purchasing power, and we do. And so all that kind of got kind of like wrapped up in my work, and I thought, these huge commercial real estate signs, they're talking to a specific audience, and I decided that I was going to create one, and it was going to talk to another audience. And I love this duality that happens, and that these things are almost like these satellites broadcasting different messages, but also competing for different messages, and this idea of craft versus manufactured, sleek versus tactile. And so they're almost in this kind of aesthetic skirmish that is happening, vying for people's attention.
Yeah, and they're also like really punchy graphically, like driving down the street in your car, you see it, you can catch that information. It stands out from the rest of the landscape around it also. And Barbara, if we go to the next image, you can see it paired really beautifully. This is in Oak Cliff, paired with one of these signs that you were talking about. That's with a really prominent Oak Cliff developer, the Jim Lake Company, right? I mean, so it's interesting.
Don't say that too loud, Randy.
Oh, sorry. Paired with a sign, and it's interesting to see these things together because it is the same size, it's the same kind of visual language, but very clearly for someone else,
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Please.
No, I was just going to kind of elaborate, on the verbiage, and so for me, No Hay Pelo was it was like, and that's the thing I love about our community, because no matter like how harsh the circumstances are, we always like shrug it off and be like, you know what, it's no big deal, we're going to get through it. And so for me, it became this kind of message of empowerment, like, no, we're going to hold it down no matter like what dire circumstances are in front of us.
Absolutely. And it's a specific type of language also that's not formal. It is the language of the people of your community can you speak to the choice of using these kind of idiomatic phrases?
Yeah. And I think you kind of hit it on the head, in the sense that, it's really the language that we use in everyday passing. It's, I think some people would consider like this bastardization of language. And I remember I did a public art project in Houston based on some of that language. And I remember when it was put online on social media, there was someone who commented on like something to the effect of like, wow, this hurts my eyes because it's poor people's language, and like why are you kind of putting that out there. And I thought, oh, how interesting, like this idea of classism or colorism kind of comes into play. And like we have a lot, our own community has a lot to work to do on how we kind of we're a little racist or discriminatory. So yeah, just be honest.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's where some of so much of the power of this language comes from, is that it is emerging from the community. It's not being put onto the community.
Right. And I felt like that was so important, right, to use that language that comes from the community, because we identify with it, we understand it. And so for me, I think one of the biggest compliments I ever got was that, when I did one of these pieces, and someone who had found out it was me came up to me, and that person said, I felt like you were talking to me. And I was like, I was. This piece was meant for you. It was meant to kind of like create this conversation with not only the community, but within yourself.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
And I also,
So
okay.
Giovanni,
I'm sorry.
please.
I feel like there's a delay and I keep cutting you off. I'm sorry. For me, it was always, this work was, I think, for so poignant but also liberating for me as an artist, because in graduate school, we're taught to stay on the grind and teach as many like adjunct classes as possible, have as many solo shows or group shows to build your CV, so that way you look, like you're doing something, so it makes you more relevant when you're applying to jobs. And when I had that Mountain View class, it was a really liberating experience when I decided to start doing this kind of public placemaking art, because for once I was in control of my own destiny, in a sense that I could create a show whenever I wanted to. I wasn't dependent on like the gallery system, or on any other institution. I would just go put it out. And so for me, that really changed the trajectory of my life. And I remember like, so a family member was like, Giovanni, why are you wasting all your money building all this stuff? And it's like, you're not making any money off of it. I was like, it was never about that. But ironically, like, opportunities, came because of that. And I think I stress this to every artist. If you have this like intuitiveness or this will to kind of put things out, then go do it. The money will come after. You just got to make the work.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think trusting your first like meaningful rule that I learned about art making, that if you're making work for a market, that it loses some of that soul. And
Yeah.
this work is really, it's for people, it's for everyone. It's not for an art gallery or a collector. It's also something that is you just put out into the world. Can you talk a bit about that, putting these images out into the world? Are you just are you putting this thing, strapping it on top of your car and driving to the site? Are you talking with the people who might own this thing? Like, how does this work? And maybe let's go to the next image and we can talk a bit about that.
Oh man, you're trying to incriminate me, man. I have to say,
if it's giving away too many secrets, we can.
No, it was funny. I had a developer who commented on it was probably like 3 or 4 weeks ago, like, I think, on one of my art pieces and how I left it on their property. They weren't very happy, but it was cool, like, but yeah, it was. They're fairly large pieces, right? I think this one's 48 by 60 inches, and so for me, I would go place them, and I actually recruited one of my really good friends, and I've known him since like 7th grade, and he's down for everything. And he's from the hood, so he's like, whatever, man, this is easy work. Because I was, you get a little paranoid when you're out like putting this stuff out and delivering it, and so. But yeah, I put it on the back of a truck, and then we went to go drop it off, and try to be as quick as possible. And like I feel like the artwork serves as this kind of interrupter, in a sense that when you're one day it's not there, and then one day it's there, and because I think fall into routines, the way we go to work, and then we see something new, and while you're waiting at the light, this thing is like staring at you, this object, and what does that mean? This quien manda, like, and so my hope is like people Google it, right? We got Google now, and so then that conversation starts. Well, what's that phrasing? Who's that message talking to? So yeah.
Absolutely. So I love this image so much. The color, the format, how it mirrors almost identically that sign, and I love that guerrilla spirit, that like DIY kind of punk spirit, also, that is like taking back your community, or or like claiming space and something that has been, like in this lot in particular, has been completely leveled and turned into a grass field ready for a developer to build condos on it.
Right, exactly. And it is about claiming that space and saying, hey, wait a minute, we're still here. Like there's a conversation to be had.
Absolutely. And the narrative that so often is being presented by developers is, this is a new place. This is a tabla rasa. It is something where we can build something new. And they forget that, there used to be 6 homes on this lot that had families living in them. That those stories get lost. And this is a really beautiful intervention to get people, I think, thinking about the history of these sites.
Oh yeah, most definitely. I mean, yeah, I think developers, one of the first things they do is kind of re-christen it a different name. Like, and it's like, I think perfect example is like West Dallas, which is rapidly being gentrified, but they kind of decided to rename it Trinity Groves, and so there's always
Yeah.
I think that's the first part of erasing history.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So you took this phrase, and then we'll jump to the next slide. And here you presented this work now in a totally different context. It's now a digital image presented on a billboard. I'm curious about that shift for you. Like, how did it feel seeing this work in a different type of setting? This is in a different city than the one that you live in. Can you speak a bit about that?
Yeah, I really think this was like the first kind of venture into the kind of political realm and ideas of messaging and what that means and political empowerment. So Quien Manda, for anyone who doesn't know, means like who runs things or who's the boss. And so for me, this was in Queens, and they did an open call, and it's kind of modeled after like a similar work. And so I just took a high res photograph and reproduced it. But it was around like I think it was around the midterm election, so it was a sense to say, what, like we have a lot of political power, within the Latinx community, and we need to kind of flex and be part of that conversation. And so to have an opportunity in a different city to kind of put that up, I think for me it was really a blessing, but also like my hope is that people took something away from that.
Absolutely. So just moving into the next image, we have now this concurrent body of work that's similar, but it's not text-based. It still uses this like really punchy, highly graphic imagery that is really arresting. I think when you're driving in somewhere like Dallas, where there's not a whole lot of color around construction sites, then suddenly these little sad houses started popping up in these sites. And can you tell us about this?
Yeah, so I kind of embarked on this new journey with the work because, I think for me, the real estate science kind of had its life. And so around this time, I was becoming more involved in community organizing and going to community meetings and working with other community organizing groups. And to be honest, like they were teaching me. And I went to this one meeting held by the Texas Tenants Union, and there was a mother who stepped up, and she was a single mother, and she said, I can't afford to stay in my apartment anymore, and I'm about to be evicted. And so the Texas Tenants Union is an advocacy group and teaches renters their rights in a sense. And I just, yeah. And so for me, Dallas is like 60% renters, which is mind boggling. And I remember thinking like, it immediately brought me back to my own upbringing when my mother was like on her own, and we would move like every year to a different rent house because she couldn't afford the rent hikes. And I remember thinking like, wow, not much has changed since I was a kid. And so I wanted to do something that would take a statistic or a number and really personalize it. And so, and hats off to like the Texas Tenants Union, because I wanted to work with an organization and put them on a like a pedestal, or bring light to the situation, so that way they could talk about these issues that were affecting people who are living in Dallas. And so I said, I got this crazy idea that I want to build these little sad houses, piñatas, and they're like, yeah, let's do this. And so every little sad house had like some postcards attached to them, and so whoever came across it, they would pull the postcard out, and then it gave them an opportunity to advocate for more affordable housing. And it also gave some details, like how much it costs to rent a house in Dallas, how much you have to make to afford a house in Dallas. And so that address was pre-addressed to the mayor's office, so people would just mail them. All they had to do was just put a stamp on it and mail it to the mayor's office. And I thought, like their approach was different, because I knew that the text-based thing was applied to a certain demographic, right? Like I was speaking to specifically to my community, but this, I felt like it had to be a little bit more open, and facial expressions, like we all get that, and then kind of borrowing from what Murakami did, like in the sense that, this kind of like super saccharine, object could then translate to someone who has no idea of what like housing is like in Dallas, but could still kind of like communicate that message. And I felt like it was pretty successful in that realm. So yeah.
Yeah, well, I think we'll skip ahead 2 images, because we have an image of the postcard that was with these houses, and these faces, gosh, they're so good. But what I think is interesting about, we can see a whole crew of these houses here. What I think is interesting here is that it is, to me, it seems like this work was really the shift that went from like art making to really like action and advocacy, and a transformation in your studio practice. Is that an accurate reading of this project?
Oh yeah, most definitely. Yeah.
Yeah. So that it's because there was also, I remember seeing you got news coverage, and you were in the Dallas Morning News, you were on TV talking about these things. Also, it was a really exciting moment for this project, I think.
Yeah, and I think that was for me, like what you said, it was a really like strong shift into the art making, in the sense that I didn't know how much power this project like yielded, in the sense, because and because of my background and like in the commercial gallery, like I knew how to write a press release. So when I was and I think that's important, right, for every artist to know, like when you're making work, it's also important to kind of craft that dialogue, so then you can kind of send it out to news media, because otherwise it'd just be this object sitting out in the public realm, and not no one would really pay attention to it. But so for me, when I sent out that press release, and I knew I wanted to send it on Christmas Eve, because a lot of people who are working on these job sites weren't going to be there because it's Christmas Day. But also, it was like I wanted to kind of pull at the heartstrings of the community. Like there are people being evicted or moving at the end of the month, instead of celebrating Christmas or New Year's with family. And so and I remember like the very first it was a local NPR station here in Dallas picked up on the story, and he gave me the best advice. He's like, Giovanni, this thing is a real story, and I think this is a message for every artist. Say yes to every interview that comes after this story. And I didn't believe him. I was like, oh, whatever, because I never thought it would kind of be as big as it would, and it blew up in a sense. Like I think on NPR stations it kind of reached nationally, and again local news media picked it up, and it also taught me about learning to speak to a certain audience, like learn who your audience is. And because I remember like the local TV station showed up at my house, and I started getting like super conceptual about the work, and she's like, "Stop, Giovanni, you got like a minute to explain what this work is. Like the whole story's a minute, and you got like 30 seconds to explain this work, and no one understands what you're saying. So make it a little bit easier to digest." I was like, okay. So yeah.
Yeah, beautiful. It sounds like you not only did this project bring you some really great attention, but also it brought you really important like life advice also, which is incredible.
Yeah, I definitely think so. I mean, I think as artists, we're always growing, especially learning new things about our career and how we can kind of, make things better. But
Mhm.
yeah, and I think for me, these little houses, and that's the thing, right? They're so kitschy and like absurd, but when you see them on the street, and I remember there was this child who asked me, because I happened to be on the street at the same time, and I was documenting the images, and this kid kind of like overheard telling his mother, like, "Why are they so sad?" Like, because that's just weird and like awkward to him, and so by him asking that question, he entered a dialogue with his mother, and and by then I kind of had left, and but I'd like to think that they had some interesting conversation about that.
Absolutely. And the next slide, we can see you working with or working on these houses. I think it's important to get a sense of the scale of these things. They're not small objects, they take up some space. You do like, you can't not see them when they are in the middle, like in a median or something like that. So I love this image of you with the houses.
Yeah, they're, I mean, they're fairly large, and like and I found it was really important to kind of release them in batches. So like, I would go put them all on, like there would be like 10 to 15 of them all released at the same time. And the interesting thing is like the community, there was like this affinity for them. And I remember someone someone sent me an email, and they're like, "We took your house. It's on the front porch if you want it back." And I'm like, "It's fine. It's a cardboard box. It's cool." Like,
Yeah.
but you started seeing them like put on people's front porches, and like these things had this kind of personality that took it. You almost kind of wanted to care for this object. It was really strange. So yeah.
It's amazing what seeing a sad face does, like it really, it pulls at your strings. Like I do like this little fuchsia guy in the back looks so concerned about what's happening. And, there's
Yeah.
whole narratives you could build around these things. I just think they're such um, smart, quick images also, which is an interesting combination.
Yeah, and I feel like, and this, I think for me, the beauty about the work, especially this project, was that you put it out into the universe, and you never know what you're gonna get out of it, right? Like you can have someone who kind of adopts this object and makes it their own, or you have like, and for me, I thought it was the most interesting thing that happened like during this whole project was that someone kind of co-opted it. And so I had put it out on his bench, and I don't think I shared this image with you, but it disappeared, like after like a few days, which is, I thought it was normal because sometimes they disappear. And but it came back like a week later, and it came back angry. Like someone put like these angry eyebrows and like like put flames inside the pupils, and it had like a little sign attached to it, and it said, um, let me see if I can get this acronym right, like GT FO, like get the F out, gentrifiers. And I was like, whoa. And I thought for that moment, wow, this community then used this like art object as a vehicle to communicate their frustrations. and then I remember like, and how I found out about it, because someone posted on social media and they were kind of griping on me about like, Giovanni, this message is supposed to be like a, understanding what's happening in the community, but I feel like, you're doing this to kind of instigate things. And I was like, well, that wasn't me. But it's important to realize that this community has a right to be upset because they're being displaced. And if they use my artwork to kind of reflect something back that's totally different, hey, that's the risk and the reward that you take. And so for me, I thought that was really interesting that there's this conversation happening with an object as the vehicle.
Absolutely. So moving into the next image, we have this, it's kind of a different body of work, something that these are more like discrete objects. They're things that hang on walls. I don't quite know what to call these things. They're both sculptures and paintings at the same time. But unlike the works, the text works or the guerrilla style works that are so punchy and graphic, these objects hold much more subtlety and layers. Can you talk a bit about this body of work?
Yeah, I mean, so I think still sticking with the language that I'm using, and language that is familiar with me. But yeah, like, because the other objects are made to be really ephemeral, and I really appreciated the idea to put these objects out into the public realm, and they are like open to any kind of like abuse, either by weather or by people. And so for me, I saw that as like this metaphor for the community in a sense, because if an object was placed outside, it starts to kind of wither away, or starts to break down. And I think it was a really strong metaphor for what the community is going through. And so with this piece, this was a much smaller, concise piece, and adopting like this armature that's usually found inside piñatas, and then this language that's being used. And apaciguate is like my ex-mother-in-law would say that to her grandchildren, and it was like, behave yourself, like behave yourself. And it was like this stern language, and I remember thinking like, wow, that is so indicative of how our community is like in a sense treated, right? Like, stay in your place, be quiet. And
Mm-hmm.
that's how I was raised, in a sense. Like, don't step out of line, you just put your head down and you work. And apaciguate is like, for me, it was just like this, let's challenge like traditional power structures, and use that language to kind of make it known, like that, that it comes down to like political empowerment. So yeah.
That's beautiful. So we'll just skip ahead 2 images because it's still kind of within the same body of work. We've moved now ahead 2 years, and the text has shifted. We now have kind of these fragments of text, and the title seems to take more of a prominent place in the tone setting of how you read this object. Can you talk a bit about the transition that we see from the last work to this one?
Wow, yeah, great eye, Randy. So this was like after the election. So I came in second, and it was a challenge because like when you run for political office, it's a different kind of atmosphere, and it becomes very like analytical, and there's not much room for creativity, and so for me, it was a challenge to kind of get back into that creative realm, because, and I think this sums it up best, because when you're on the campaign trail, it is really about repeating talking points and different versions of your stump speech. It just becomes practice, and you say it over and over and over. And I remember, like, at the time, my campaign manager was like, in the beginning, he's like, Giovanni, stop veering off. Stay on your talking points. And I was like, but it's so boring. Like, I feel like people have listened to it 1,000 times. And he was like, it's not boring, and it's consistency. And that's what you're going to be kind of ranked, like graded on, like you're consistent. I was like, okay. So when you're in that mindset for like, 3 to 6 months of just repeating that, and like after I ran, I was like, as an artist, I was like, where does the work go? Because up until like I ran for office, the work was like leading up to that point, even though I didn't know it, it was becoming an extension of the work. And so now it's like recalibrating and kind of thinking about what that work means. And so a marginal universe, the title comes from, um, in kind of political talk, is it's like there's a voter universe, and in that voter universe, you it's a numbers game, right? So you know who your base is and who you can go after to kind of create this kind of voter universe that's going to vote for you. And like the idea of like being a part of that marginal universe, came from the idea that I wasn't going to go after the traditional voters, which happen to be wealthy white people who live in my neighborhood, which probably make up about 27% of the neighborhood. That I was going to go after the bigger demographic, which happens to be working poor, working class Latinx people. And so, those are just kind of like fragmentations of my leftover campaign material, and also like news clippings. So yeah.
Oh, fascinating. Okay, so now that you mentioned that, I'm starting to see that your bits of your name and the little house and some of that graphic identity that you used for your campaign collateral. That's fascinating. It takes on a totally different meaning for me now, knowing that. That's
Yeah.
fascinating.
Yeah, and I think it kind of takes on, that the state of mind where I was at, that it was trying to make order of this chaos of coming out of the campaign trail and, reacclimating to me being an artist.
Yeah, and then in the next image, we see some of the text returns, but now the text is not the title of the work like we had seen in previous images. And so it seems like this one's kind of taken, it's a year after the last image we just saw, and it's taken some bits from that last one plus the work before, and also like breaking out of this rectangle. It is really, it's bursting forth with energy, this work.
Yeah, and thanks for pointing it out. Yeah, it is this thing that I wanted to kind of, portray as expanding and kind of like not really in control of what's happening in the pictorial space. And for me, the language, and I was still on this idea, and it took me about a good year to kind of think about like, where was my place? Am I an artist, advocate, activist? What is my role in my community? And so for me, I felt like this work was kind of like part of that journaling kind of thing, because when we think about politics, it's really about, and El Club de Viejos is like, it's like the old man's like club. It is like, and in politics we find that someone like myself is not welcomed into this club, because I am this person who does not kiss the ring, who doesn't follow, who doesn't wait in line, to be tapped, to run. And we see that so often in politics. And so for me, it's just like, I felt like having that conversation and kind of like putting that out there. And so this perennial package is like this idea that you wait your turn until you're chosen. And for me, I think that's really the dark side of politics that no one really understands. And being in that position, we're kind of learning how that is and how that works, and how someone once told me, Giovanni, you're going to find out who your real friends are when you run for office. And I was like, oh, whatever. And it was so true. Like, people who I thought were my best, like my confidants, were like like knife to the back. I'm like, oh,
Wow.
whoa. So, I think that piece is so wrapped up in all that kind of, that turmoil that happens. I mean, hats off to anybody who runs for office, because it is a mental beatdown, because you are told on a daily basis why you're insufficient or inferior, why your ideas don't work. And it's just like, and it's yeah, I think you have to have a really strong mental like toughness. And
Mhm.
as an artist, we all are extremely sensitive, and I think that's what makes us really great artists, because we reflect that back. And so for me, it was like a really strong learning experience.
Well, what I think is interesting about this work is that in the guerrilla style interventions of text objects were really about a communal voice. And
Mhm.
these last two works that we've seen are really so deeply personal to your own voice. And in that way, they also become, universal, because they are so specific. And I think that's a really interesting transition that's happening in your work.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I think I completely agree, because it's
Mhm.
I think in a sense I am allowing to for other people to experience what I did, because I think most artists we're completely introspective, and like we are introverts, and so by being able to kind of share like my experiences through the work, my hope is that they get some kind of idea or glimpse.
Absolutely. And the last work that we'll visit is the next slide. It's called Grit Grind. And I think this really is a really poetic way for us to end, because it is combining that pinata imagery that we saw early on, but it also has this deeply personal connection for you in the imagery. This work was commissioned by the Nasher Sculpture Center in Dallas. Can you tell us a bit about this work and the process of arriving at this image?
Yeah. So yeah, interesting stories. Like I, this was like it was an art piece that I had wanted like to do for a while, and I just and it was during the lockdown. It was just like, okay, I have like I have some extra time on my hand, and so I decided that I was gonna kind of recreate this life-size replica of my mother's very first car, which was a 1986 Nissan Sentra. And I was initially go put it out in the public space somewhere, and just by happenstance, the Nasher, sent me an email, and they're like, "Hey, we're interested in, featuring like local artists, and we'd like to know if you'd be interested." And I was like, "Well, I'm actually working on this piece right now." Um, and so they were like totally open for it, and I was extremely grateful. And so yeah, I started working at it, but the intent was always to leave it out in the neighborhood. And so, it had this kind of one context in the gallery setting, but after the run was over, I went to go drop it off in the neighborhood on a sidewalk, I think. And so for me, grit grind is like this metaphor for this departure, like of the American dream, in a sense, and this idea that in the 1950s and 60s, like having this car meant freedom. And but I think today, and this was directly influenced by like the COVID lockdown, in the sense that our community got really hit hard with COVID, and so they started opening up testing sites in our neighborhoods, and you would see these long lines, and even longer lines, and when they're distributing food. And so this idea of this relationship with vehicles, and it brought me back again to when I was a kid, because it was no longer this freedom of the open road, and it was really this idea of this utilitarian object that is helping you survive. And
Mhm.
so for me, it took on a different meaning and symbolism because that car back in 1986, we were no longer dependent on public transit, which was late and it sucked. Um, we were no longer dependent on like family and friends giving us rides. We had a freedom to get to point A and back to point B.
Mhm.
And, like I decided that, this vehicle would also, be missing a wheel. Um, and I think it just spoke to the grit that we have in this neighborhood. It's like, shit happens and we're gonna get, like no matter what. Because it always happens like in pairs, like something bad happens and then something else has to come along right with it.
Yeah.
And so I think the most beautiful part about this, when I set it out in the public, so after it was over,
Let's go to the next slide. We have
yeah,
a picture of that.
perfect. And this is what I love about it, right? When you put it out in the neighborhood, and so I reached out to um, this kind of local developer. Like he's more into the preserving old buildings. So, and he was actually one of my harshest critics in the beginning because he was like, gentrification isn't real, Giovanni, and we would have back and forths and we developed this kind of relationship out of that. And so when I had this idea to put this object out and I knew he owned property, I was like, would you let me do it? And then he was like, yeah, why not? Let's do it. And so, and he was totally game. And what I love about it is like it deteriorated over time, but as you can see, like the wheels started disappearing. And by the end of the by the end of the duration of the project, like all the wheels were gone. I was like, isn't that like so poetic? Because that's what happens in the neighborhood. It's like
Yeah.
you see a car without its wheels. So yeah.
That's so fascinating. And it was also this like highly visible pub intersection too. I used to live just a few blocks away from this intersection, and just the thousands of people drive through this intersection every day, the visibility of the sculpture must have really been off the charts. I also noticed, is there a parking ticket on the car?
I was gonna point that out. Yeah. So apparently someone they made like a handwritten parking ticket and they put it on there. And I thought it was hilarious. I was like, wow. And that's what I love about the work because it allows people to engage with it and then contribute to the piece. So yeah, it was hilarious.
That's so cool. I love that people feel like they have this kind of ownership also. Like when you put something out into the world, now it's left you and it's existing in its own space. And just like the sad house turning into an angry house, the community has responded and come back in this kind of tongue-in-cheek way, but also in this way that is really poetic, with the handmade ticket. And I think about, gosh, the last thing I want to deal with when I have, no tires on my car is to now have to pay a parking ticket on top of that. It's a really interesting comment also on like the cycle of how you can get trapped in some of this stuff.
Oh yeah, totally. And I'm glad you pointed that out. Yeah, it's expensive to be poor. I mean, at
Yes.
the end of the day. Mhm.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Giovanni, this is about all of the time that we have today. I'm so grateful for you taking the time to chat with me. And is there anything that you want to share? Actually, I have one question
Okay.
before we wrap up, and it's, what advice do you have to artists who want to become more socially and civically engaged, not only with their artwork, but with their lives?
Mm. I think for me, it's like acknowledging that we yield a certain power to change the trajectory that we are like on as like a community. And if we could then use that, the sky's the limit. It's just like we can start a conversation that no one else can, right? Like on the one hand, like protesting, that's great. It's a tool in the tool bag. But on the same point, it's like it turns off a lot of people. But when you start to incorporate artwork into it, like for me, the work has always been it's been this idea of inviting people to the conversation. And so I think if we could then capitalize off our art making practice and bring a different kind of perspective to that conversation, it changes everything. And so one of my biggest, you know, like one of the biggest like advice that I could give is like be in tune with your community. And that's what it took me. I had to start going to a bunch of community meetings and understanding what the situation was and how I could contribute that in my own way. And so, but I think for me, my parting message would be run for office, because man, do we need some help. Just like, and that's the thing though, because like at least in Dallas, like we are dead last in all 50 US major cities in voting. So I knew that there's an opportunity. So on city council level, like 1,500 votes could decide an election. And so, and I always say this, artists are like the smartest people I know, the most brilliant, creative problem solvers. So imagine if we take that mindset into city policy and how that could make such a strong difference, because a lot of people, they feel like this city doesn't work for them. Like this city, and it doesn't. And I can totally understand that. But if we get like regular people centered around policy, then policy can work for regular people.
Absolutely. Gosh, thank you so much for your time today, Giovanni. It has been such a pleasure getting to talk with you, reconnect, and I am so grateful for your time today. Thank you.
Man, I'm grateful for y'all's time. And again, thank you so much for the opportunity. I'm always grateful. I can't wait till I'm in San Antonio next. I'll have to look you up. So pretend like you know me when I call you.
Absolutely. We'll explore the Riverwalk.
There we go. We're going to wear matching t-shirts. All right.
Perfect. Yes. All right. Well, thank you all so much for joining us today. And I hope you all have a wonderful evening. And Giovanni, I hope you have a great evening. Thank you.
Thank you. You too.